If Toronto or Vancouver are just too expensive for you, go move somewhere else. Thanks to Elon Musk and Starlink, you can watch your precious TikToks anywhere in the country.
There's no one suggesting that people who bought homes in the 70s, 80s, 90s, anytime, that they didn't work hard. The problem is that just doesn't pay off now.
The basic marker of a functioning society is whether every generation has the opportunity to be better off than the last. And in my opinion, it's pretty dismal if Canada is in a place where, forget better off, we can't even afford to birth another generation.
Hi, and welcome to The Missing Middle. I'm Cara Stern.
And I'm Mike Moffatt, but today I'll be playing the role of Uncle Mike, everyone's overly opinionated baby boomer / early Gen X relative.
Also today, we're thrilled to welcome our new co-host, Sabrina Maddeaux, who will fill in for me once I start my mat leave in the new year. She's joining us today to help you prepare for family time over the holidays when that boomer or Gen X in your life starts to tell you that you're just not working hard enough to own a home.
Thanks, Cara. I'm so excited to join the show, and I can't wait to dispel some of these common myths about housing with you.
But before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you. So, you millennials, you don't know what unaffordable housing truly looks like. Yeah, home prices seem high, but you've had ultra low interest rates for your entire lives. But you go back when we were growing up, go back to the 70s and 80s and 90s, we were paying double-digit interest rates. We were doing that well into the mid-90s. So pretty much unlike you guys, all of our payments just went off to paying off the interest and paying off the bank, which made it nearly impossible to actually pay off the house.
Okay, so a little bit of what you're saying is true, but a lot of it isn't in the big picture. While interest rates were higher a few decades ago, purchase prices of homes were just so much lower, which is ultimately what those rates are applied to determine payments. So while it's true those rates briefly went above 20% in the early 80s and then hovered a bit over 10% for most of the decade, that's when the average Toronto home price was under $100,000. Today, that average is $1.1 million. So let's do some quick math to show the problem here. A 25-year mortgage on a $100,000 home at 18% in the 80s would result in monthly payments of around $1,730. Now, a 25-year mortgage on a $1.1 million home at an average rate of 4.7% results in monthly payments of, get this, $6,070. So in that current scenario, the monthly payment is about $4,900 more than the 1980s scenario. So ultimately, even higher interest on lower principal results in more manageable mortgages. And workers just aren't making high enough wages today to make up that difference. So today's affordability crisis just simply isn't about mortgage rates. It's about the fundamental disconnect between home prices and incomes.
I remember this coming up in our first episode ever, and Mike said something like, prices were so low, so even though interest rates were high, why didn't you just buy it in cash? And I know it sounds harsh, and a lot of people listening would feel like that's kind of unreasonable, saying, we couldn't just pay it in cash. I mean, you could live at home for a few years and put down a substantial down payment. But honestly, now in terms of how many years of income you need in order to buy a home, it's not so different from putting down 20% now compared to buying a whole home then. And yes, you can put down about 5% if it's under $1 million, which would be $50K on a $1 million home. That's possible, but it's also incredibly tough when the average rent, like in Toronto, it's for one bedroom is $2,300 now, and the median household income is still under $80K, according to the most recently available data. But also leveraging yourself that much is really scary. I can't imagine taking on that much debt where you buy $1 million home, you put $50,000 down, end up with a $950,000 mortgage. First of all, your income has to be incredibly high, but also it doesn't give you much room. If home prices go down before all of a sudden you owe money on the home that you're underwater, you have to pay it. That's a terrible situation to be in. And I don't think that any responsible financial advisor would recommend that. Personally, I think it makes a lot more sense to be hoping to have higher interest rates and lower costs because you could just pay it off sooner.
Well, I'm not sure who this Mike character is. He's probably just another millennial who wants everything for free. Unlike our generation, we worked hard. We saved up for a down payment and we paid off our mortgages. But All you whiners do is ask YouTube influencers like Mr. Beast to buy you a home. That is when you're not too busy demanding handouts for the government. Why don't you just work harder like we did and buy yourselves a home?
Okay, well, young people aren't asking for handouts. They're mostly asking for the government to actually get out of the way and stop interfering in the market through both restricting supply and juicing demand. And now there are so many examples on how various levels of government are actively making housing less affordable, but one of the most egregious is the rapid growth of development charges, which tax new homes at higher rates than cigarettes or alcohol, even though they're clearly essential and a public good. So in Toronto alone, these charges have gone up nearly 6,000% in 25 years. On a bachelor or one bedroom unit, the average charge is now around $53,000. And on a detached home, it's nearly $140,000. So at those levels, housing can just simply never be affordable for middle-class Canadians. And then you add in supply restrictions related to zoning approvals and building codes, plus demand issues like uncapped immigration, allowing 30-year mortgages, creating the first-time home savings account. Politicians say they want affordable housing, but then they go ahead and create policy that all but guarantees prices will continue to rise and certainly not fall to affordable levels. So the work hard and save money method just doesn't work in today's rate market.
It drives me crazy when I hear people talking about how, like, we worked hard for it, so you should just work hard too. And I'm like, there's no one suggesting that people who bought homes in the 70s, 80s, 90s, anytime, that they didn't work hard. Like, I know that a lot of people worked hard for what they had. In fact, I would say most people probably worked hard for what they had. The problem is that just doesn't pay off now. When I hear someone say that, what I often try to say is, yes, I know you worked hard, and the version of you that worked exactly as hard with the exact same life circumstances would not have the same kind of wealth that you had. And it's just because the economy doesn't work the same way. I look at, like, when my parents were growing up, post-secondary education was incredibly cheap compared to now, and actually led to a decent job. I was looking at a StatsCan data that showed that in 1990, annual tuition was $1,500 on average, and adjusted for inflation, it should be just a little more than double that, but in reality, it's about $7,000. And that doesn't include the living costs, which of course is a huge portion of it. If you're lucky enough to live near university, you could live at home, but otherwise, you're out of luck. And now it's really hard to get a job with just a basic undergraduate degree. Like, that was something that actually led to a well-paying career before. And rent was affordable. You could buy a home within a few years of working. I know a lot of people who bought their first home in my parents' generation most of them were in their 20s. Nowadays, most people aren't getting into their first home until later than that. You can't even get on the property ladder with buying your first cheap home and then hoping to upgrade, because taxes are so high. Land transfer taxes in Toronto, you're paying a year's income on that. It's so expensive. So it's a big disincentive to do that. And it's also just become much more expensive to build everywhere, as Sabrina said. In 1999, a 2-bed condo paid just $1,348 in development charges, and now it's $80,000. And that's a huge amount that the buyer has to pay just to build. And this trend is the same everywhere, basically, in this country. So I have no doubt that people worked hard for what they got, but I also have no doubt that millennials and Gen Zs are working very hard right now too, without getting the same rewards. So something is really broken, and any government intervention should make it easier for people to get the benefits of hard work.
Oh, come on, you guys know it's not just housing. You don't want to pay for anything. Again, we worked hard for decades, paid our own way. And now it's not just housing. You want our tax dollars to pay for your kids' daycare. You should pay for it like everyone else. And if you don't want to, then maybe you shouldn't be having kids.
The basic marker of a functioning society is whether every generation has the opportunity to be better off than the last. And in my opinion, it's pretty dismal if Canada is in a place where, forget better off, we can't even afford to birth another generation, or only the very wealthiest can procreate. Not to mention this concept that if you can't afford to have kids, you shouldn't have them is just cruel on an individual level for people and families who do want children or want more children. And it's not just individual, though. This is a societal issue. Declining fertility rates plus our aging population equals a crisis for everyone. In 2023, Canada had the lowest fertility rate it's ever recorded at 1.26 children per woman. We need more young people in this country to keep the economy going, to pay for things like old age security and for healthcare. And if we throw off the population balance like that, continue to throw it off, we all end up in deep water. Delaying childbirth also incurs extra fertility and healthcare costs to families and the taxpayer, A lot of women now simply can't afford to start their families until their late 30s or even maybe early 40s. And if they have to go through things like IVF, that's really expensive on a personal level, which again means you maybe can't pay for rent or you can't pay for that home to start your family as well. But when we're talking about more and more provincial healthcare plans covering fertility treatments, that's an additional cost on the taxpayer. So it's really in everyone's interest for young people to be able to afford to have children.
When it comes to things like childcare, like one thing that I experienced was I have never had a day with so much Twitter hate as when I posted something about planning that I was having a kid who I would not be having if there wasn't this childcare program, because we just like simply couldn't afford it. The housing costs are just too high that like the math doesn't work. And so many people got angry and were like, angry, screaming, tweeting at me, being like, you shouldn't have kids if you need the government to pay for it, or if you have to rely on government subsidies in order to have them. But when I think about like all the gatekeepers that have been blocking daycare spaces from expanding, they made it a scarce resource when it really shouldn't be. It's like, it's not a coincidence that they're so expensive. You hear it all the time, but the same issues that affect housing affect childcare spaces, where like people are like, I don't want this in my neighborhood because you'll have people dropping off their kids. And I find that a very weird thing. Like, is that so horrible to have a daycare space? And like, don't you really want your neighborhood to be a place where people can actually raise a family? And I guess it's fair for someone to say, well, if you can't afford to have kids, then don't have them. But I'd like to see the same people advocating for government to get out of the way and allow people to access family-sized homes, even if it's in their own neighborhoods, that are ones where people can afford to raise kids. Like it's one thing to say, don't rely on the government, but then also to use the government and its policies to make it more difficult is incredibly frustrating. And as Sabrina mentioned, like we have reached very low, the lowest all time in Canada for fertility rates. And if you look at where all the biggest drops were, they were all since 2018. And I'm not surprised considering the rate of housing price increases in that same period. Some of that drop in fertility is that people are choosing to have fewer kids, and that's absolutely a part of it. But we know that women in Canada are already having fewer kids than they want, and I'm really worried about a country and a society where someone feels that they cannot have a kid no matter how much they want to, that it's just out of reach. That's a really scary place for Canada to be.
Not everyone has to live in Toronto. It's a big country with a lot of land and cheaper places to live. If Toronto or Vancouver are just too expensive for you, go move somewhere else. Thanks to Elon Musk and Starlink, you can watch your precious TikToks anywhere in the country. So you really don't need to be here.
Oh, this version of Mike, man.
I know,
It's
I love
rough. It's really rough. So, Mike, it's not just a matter of living in Toronto or not. And of course, not everyone needs to live in Toronto or Vancouver or even a major city. But it's just not a matter anymore of living in a downtown core versus a suburb. The entire concept of driving until you're qualified just doesn't exist anymore with the way prices are today. The housing crisis reaches hours out from major urban centers across practically entire provinces. The places that young people used to move to are also now out of reach. So my friends that moved out of Toronto maybe a decade ago, a lot of them moved to Hamilton. But even Hamilton, its average home price is now around $820,000. Those same people would not have been able to move there today. In Barrieven, it's now around $780,000. And the reality of where jobs and economic centers are just makes moving to increasingly remote and rural markets where housing is still somewhat affordable impractical for a lot of families. Once you're talking about a 2-hour commute, that's just not something people can feasibly do for the long term. Remote work isn't what it was during the pandemic either. People are being asked to go back to offices, so they just can't simply live hours away from work. And what happens if they want to switch careers or they lose a job? Then they end up stuck. Add to that the impact on social fabrics and communities. I think there's really something important about being able to start a family or live close to your friends, your community, your parents, your grandparents, if that's what you want to do. Those social ties are so important, and we're breaking them apart by essentially forcing young people to, again, move hours away or to an entire different province or a different country. And speaking of that, brain drain is a major issue for cities, provinces, and Canada as a whole. Our young people are fleeing in droves. Ontario, for example, has seen a substantial outmigration of 100,000 people in the last 4 years alone, and that's largely been driven by affordability and housing concerns. The people who are leaving are the exact young professionals and families we need most. And when we talk about labor shortages in areas like construction, like healthcare, like education, again, those people can't afford to have a home or raise a family in Ontario or even Canada. So we're losing them. And that's a problem for everyone.
Yeah, I don't know who people are expecting to work those low or even middle wage jobs if people cannot afford to live in the GTA or anywhere that's near a city. Like if they have to commute in to work a minimum wage jobs, who's going to be working at all these places that require it? Who's going to be like those personal support workers or early childhood educators is one I think about a lot, because it's really important to have a daycare nearby within your city. Otherwise, it makes your life so much more difficult if you're going to have to drive very far before work and after work. But those people who are working in these jobs need a place to live too. It also just exports the problem. Like when I started covering housing issues, a lot of people said to me, this is just a Toronto and Vancouver problem. And they weren't 100% wrong in the sense that like there were still affordable places outside of major cities. But then people did move, and now it's become unaffordable everywhere in this country. If you look in the last 5 years alone, single family home prices have more than doubled in Moncton and gone up over 80% in Tillsonburg, Ontario. I remember hearing about during the pandemic that was like one of the fastest rising places to live. And it's thanks to families moving to these smaller communities, even though mortgage rates have been going up. So people are moving. We need people who to be able to live in so many different cities and so many different sizes of cities. They can't all be just rich people in cities and everyone else middle class and anyone lower than middle class far away from the cities. It doesn't work.
You know, take it from Uncle Mike, stuff costs money. That was true in the 70s, it was true in the 80s, it's true in the 90s, and it's still true today. And we had way more inflation back then. But you know what we did when we needed more money? We went out and got ourselves a better job. If your paycheck isn't going as far as you like, you ask for a raise or go work for someone who will. You don't ask for handouts.
The thing is that just doesn't work anymore. In today's reality, it doesn't matter what job you have. Buying a home is practically impossible without family help or an inheritance. Even a great professional job that makes over 6 figures doesn't nearly cut it. So to comfortably manage an $800,000 home purchase based on the CMHC's 30% rule, which states that you shouldn't spend more than 30% of your income on housing, you need to make $245,000 or more a year. That's massive. There are a lot of professionals with really great jobs. They make over 6 figures and they're still not making that amount. And even when you talk about people who are working class and are making less than 6 figures, a lot of them have side hustles these days, which is really a euphemism for young people working second and third jobs, and yet they still can barely afford rent, or they certainly can't afford a home. And never mind that the average home price in Ontario is now above that figure I just cited. It's $878,000, $620,000. And then in the GTA, it's over 1.1 million. So home buying has been completely disconnected from the notion of merit, working your way up, or having a quote unquote good job.
And nothing shows this more than watching governments make proposals on how to help people buy a home. The city of Toronto recently proposed to increase the income limit for its program that basically it waives fees for nonprofit builders, and then the savings are passed on to people as down payment support. So right now, the maximum household income is $102,000 to qualify for this, and they want to raise it to $160,000 per year. And I suspect that most people think that a household making $160,000 per year shouldn't need government assistance, but here we are. That's something like the top 20% of people are the only people excluded from this below market housing. And I don't know what's a realistic percentage of the population that should be able to afford market housing versus below market housing, but I suspect it shouldn't be that the whole bottom 80% needs below market subsidized by the government. We've seen this in a lot of government plans lately, trying to help people who are making so much money that like they should be basically able to afford a home anywhere they want. If it was maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and now they need government assistance just to buy their first home wherever they can.
So I keep seeing young people crying on TikTok about how all the old people, they're hoarding the money, they're taking the money, they have all the money. But guess what? Those folks are old. And you know what happens to old people? They die. And what happens when they die? They have these inheritance, and all of that money and the homes and the cars and the beanie babies, they're all going to go to you guys. So why are you complaining so much? You're going to get these massive inheritances for doing absolutely nothing beyond being born in the greatest country in the world.
Well, I'm not sure who's going to accept that down payment of beanie babies, but that aside, do we really want a society where homeownership is only achieved through inheritance or family wealth? I know I don't, because that's not a capitalist society. That's us trending back towards a feudal society. And a lot of inheritances might not even happen. There's a long way to go. And when we talk about the rising costs of old age homes and healthcare, a lot of that money might disappear in the coming years. And even for those of us who end up getting them, millennials are now in their 30s, their 40s. They're already starting families, or they would like to start families if they can't afford them. They want to put down roots. They want to buy that home. And those inheritances might not happen until we're well into our 50s and 60s, at which point the economic damage is done. So inheritances just aren't the answer on a societal or a personal level.
Yeah, we have no idea how much money will be left once people are pay for long-term care. When I started hearing about how much it costs nowadays, I can't believe it. Like it's an absurd amount of money per month for long-term care homes in a lot of this country. And it's like, I don't know how much money is going to be left over for people to pass on to their kids when they have between that and paying for their retirements. But I also just worry about people who their parents maybe didn't get in early enough to own a home, or ones where their parents just can't or don't want to help. There's lots of people out there where the parents are not going to pass on that money. Maybe they'll give it away to charity. We don't know. Maybe they'll spend it on their last bunch of years just enjoying their life, which is they're totally their right to do so. They shouldn't have to save it to pass on to their kids for their kids to have a decent life in Canada. And I just think that we basically just tell people, sorry, if your parents can't or won't help you, you're out of luck. Doesn't matter how hard you work, you're screwed in Canada. That's a very dangerous place for Canada to be in.
Well, I think we're going to have to agree to disagree. And, I will fully admit you're not getting everything you wanted. You're losing your precious bike lanes. But I still think you're underestimating the value of those beanie babies.
Well, hopefully this helped some people who are listening to this, that maybe that you will be able to come to your holiday dinner armed with some facts to be able to argue back against whoever is in your life that's just telling you that you're just not working hard enough. Hopefully there's some information here that'll make your conversations a little bit easier. And if you want to talk about bike lanes, we do have a video on that, so we can link to that in the show notes.
Thank you so much, everyone, for watching and listening. And thanks again to our producer, Meredith Martin.
And if you have any thoughts or questions about the history of interest rates or the opinion of Gen Xers, please send us an email to missingmiddlepodcast@gmail.com.
And we'll see you next time.